Welcome to this edition of the Ann Arbor Shield. My name is Officer Jeffery Ford. I am with the Ann Arbor Police Department, assigned to Special Services, which is the traffic unit. The purpose of today's show is we are talking about pedestrian safety. I have a guest here, Mr. Eli Cooper from the City Planning Department. And what we'd like to start out with is we'd like to look at some video. We had some controversy through the media in regards to pedestrian crossing in the crosswalks, also a public service announcement. So let's go ahead and roll the video.
If your dad was crossing, you'd stop. If your favorite Aunt Judy was crossing, you'd stop. If your high school biology teacher, Mrs. Jones, was crossing, you'd stop. If your next door neighbor, Dan, was crossing, you'd stop. If your niece, Kelly, was crossing, even though you think she's sort of flaky, you'd stop. Even if someone dressed in a chicken suit was crossing because you love chickens, you'd stop. In Ann Arbor, we stop for pedestrians at crosswalks. Period. It's the law.
Walk controversy in Ann Arbor. Tonight, hundreds of drivers have been ticketed in recent weeks for violating a city ordinance meant to protect pedestrians, but some say it's too strict and that out-of-town drivers don't even know about it. 7 Action News reporter Kimberly Craig is live in Ann Arbor tonight with this growing debate. Kim?
And it certainly is a growing one, Carol, and depending on the time of day, this crosswalk behind me here on State Street is very busy. And while the sign says drivers must stop for pedestrians within the crosswalk, that also includes people waiting to cross. And some think that ordinance may go too far, and some pedestrians even feeling bad for the drivers.
We walk whenever we want.
In Ann Arbor, it can sometimes seem like it's the pedestrians against the drivers when it comes to crosswalks, especially near or on campus.
I think, pedestrians still have that right of way, so obviously they have to stop.
You just got to take it, to be honest. You got to be aggressive and you got to just take what you want. You got to get to class.
And local ordinance requires drivers to stop not just for anyone in the crosswalk, but also for anyone waiting to cross or with their feet on the ramp to the crosswalk. And if we were in class, some drivers like this one would get an F for failing to yield to those standing just a few feet away. And check out the driver of this SUV. Pedestrians clearly waiting to walk, but the driver continues on anyway. Ann Arbor police have been cracking down on drivers who do not stop for pedestrians waiting to use the crosswalk. And this week, City Council voted to review the ordinance.
There's been some favorable replies and some not so favorable replies. So they've got it up to their office now, and they're going to have another look at it, see if it's the right thing to do here in town.
Here at South University in South State, heavy foot traffic had this driver stopping right on the crosswalk.
It's a real struggle.
I think we need it, but I understand that people who are from out of town, and we have so many people from out of town, that they may not realize that people who are on the side of the sidewalk need to have the car stop.
You should be driving super slowly anyways, but you need to stop. Don't revise it. It's the perfect policy for this campus and for any campus.
And during the last police crosswalk enforcement detail, officers issued about 230 tickets during an 8-day operation. And the next crackdown, Carolyn, is set to begin on October 30th, and it will last for 2 weeks at 7 locations here in Ann Arbor. Back to you.
Wow, Kim, cities are often criticized by those who suggest when they do these crackdowns, should I say, they're just out to make a lot of money. So how much are these tickets?
Yeah, these tickets are $140 each, so it's pretty steep. But the city says this is all about safety and not about money. Back to you.
Wow, did you say 140 or 160?
140.
Wow.
But when you're that high, 140, 160, but it's still a lot of money.
A lot of money, Kim. All right, thank you so much for the live report.
Hi, Eli. Can you explain what your job is with the City of Ann Arbor today?
I'm the city's transportation program manager, and my 15-second elevator speech is I work with everything that moves, some things that don't. The ones that don't are parking. Things that move include pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles in transit on our transportation system.
Okay, so then you're very familiar with the crosswalks and how the ordinance affects them, the design and planning behind them and things like that, correct?
Absolutely.
Do you think that the city could have done a better job when they first rolled out the new ordinance as far as educating the public on this?
So when we go back, we're talking back 10 years ago, it's 2008, 2009 when the first resolution came before City Council, and we actually had a budget and did public outreach and communication at that time. So could we do better? I think if we had more resources available in order to have a broader outreach campaign, but we did work with the AATA and had signs on buses, inside buses. We worked with the Downtown Development Authority and had posters in the garages so drivers who were parking in our downtown could see information about the rules as they relate to pedestrians. So there was a wide campaign. The interesting piece that I'm going to reinforce here is this might be a local ordinance, but it's also a responsibility of every driver. I brought with me here today some excerpts from a document called What Every Driver Must Know, and this is a Secretary of State document, and it talks about the pedestrian right-of-way in a crosswalk, marked and unmarked. So the rules that the city has embraced are at the local level, but it's consistent with the overall state responsibility of every driver.
So basically what you're saying is that these are not different laws, they are the law that the state uses. There might be just some procedures that are a little bit different.
Yeah, if I were to focus on what's different, I mean, as was said on the last segment on the news tape, was that the protection to the pedestrian in Ann Arbor extends to the curb. So where the motor vehicle code relates to the crosswalk, the pedestrian in the street, what we have in our local code is if there's a person who's at the curb line and they're ready to cross the street, that they not necessarily have to step out in front of moving traffic in order to establish the right-of-way. And I think it's just one additional increment of safety or margin of safety for pedestrians. But I'd also like to be clear for those who might be saying, oh, well, this isn't fair. It is fair because the ordinance and the motor vehicle code requires pedestrians not to suddenly step off of a sidewalk into the path of oncoming traffic. And you would know this as an officer, motorist that violates a crosswalk would be subject to whether it's the city code or the state ordinance, but a pedestrian also shouldn't jump into a crosswalk causing a driver to have a sudden reaction. That would be a citable offense under both the city code and the vehicle and the Michigan Vehicle Code.
So what I think you're telling me is there's a shared responsibility here both between the drivers and the pedestrians. You would not suggest pedestrians to be using their phone, not paying attention, or just blindly crossing at a crosswalk.
So I remember hearing this when I was in grade school, look both ways and make sure it's safe before you cross. Those rules that I heard some 50 years ago are still in effect today. It really is in everyone's best interest for a pedestrian to stop, look both ways, make sure it's safe. That doesn't mean that you have to let every car that's within your sight distance to pass through, but that you shouldn't suddenly step into a crosswalk. You shouldn't be looking at your cell phone. You know, what's the expression? Plugged in and tuned out. You don't want to do that when you're walking across the street.
Did you have any input on the study that was done by Western Michigan University professor and was also verified through National Highway Traffic Safety Foundation on our enforcement action? Were you involved with that at all?
I was involved with the planning team, so my primary responsibility within the city is as a planner. And so in terms of identifying the locations, it was more the traffic engineering and enforcement staff that actually established the methodologies that were used. I know there were cones placed out that established what that safe stopping distance was, so that if a vehicle was behind that cone, it established the recognition that the driver should be operating their vehicle in a way that they could safely stop and avoid running into the pedestrian or crossing into the crosswalk. So I'm familiar with the methodologies, but I was more involved, if you will, on the backside of it, helping with the communication strategy a little bit, and more specifically identifying those crosswalks that were known both for the actual enforcement activities as well as the benchmarking sites that were selected that were measured not necessarily by the police department but by the research team.
So you felt the way that it was conducted was done properly and fairly towards the drivers as far as giving them enough room to stop prior to the pedestrians coming out?
It was done by the book, and when I say by the book, what we had was a PhD level researcher in transportation engineering working with our police forces, and there were specific measurements taken. The folks who were the pedestrians were trained in how and when to step into the crosswalk. So I would have to say that it was done as well as could be. I want to add one thing though, because I know in your work, oftentimes you're the target of, oh my God, there's an enforcement, and even on the video, they're trying to generate money. The fact is that this targeted enforcement campaign is not an intent to create a sting in order for someone to have to reach into their pocket and make a contribution. What has occurred, even at the media coverage, is what the intent is. Targeted enforcement is to raise the public awareness about the issue, about what the rules are. The fact that I'm having this conversation with you and it's based on some media interest and community interest, this is all positive. It's going to add to the body of knowledge that our community has about the rules, not just the rules within the city, but the rules of courtesy on our state's roadways.
Yeah, we don't go out to enforce to raise revenue, buy tickets or something like that. Basically, our function is to give more safety to the public out there. One of the reasons we're doing this show here today is, again, to make more awareness out there to the people that are viewing the show, to understand a little bit better what went behind the design, what went behind the enforcement action in these crosswalks. What I'd like to go ahead and do now is I would like to go ahead and show some slides in regards to different crosswalks in the city. The first crosswalk we're looking at here is Packard and Koehler. This crosswalk has a small median that's based in between the roadways. It would probably be in what you would consider a left-hand turn lane. Can you explain why that was set up in that area for that specific reason?
That is a typical major mid-block crossing design. It has a pedestrian crossing island. The value for that island is, without the island, a pedestrian would have to cross the entire width of the street. In this instance, it's probably about a 30-foot wide street, and would have to have clear traffic in both directions before they could step off the curb and get safely to the other side of the street. Placing the crossing island in the middle allows for the pedestrian to just look in one direction, because you have a safe resting place in the middle of the roadway. So you narrow which direction. You don't have to have a clear direction both ways. You just need to get a gap in traffic in one direction. You can then safely walk halfway, get to the safe crossing island, turn your attention in the opposite direction, and instead of having to cross the entire 30 feet, you're looking at a lane width of 10 to 11 feet that is about half the time or less than half the time that it would take to cross the entire street. So it's a very effective way to enable pedestrian safety.
I like that. There's only two questions I have on that. One is traffic, if it's on the opposite end of the island, are they required to stop as the pedestrian steps in the roadway, or do they only have to stop once he gets closer to the island to allow him to cross?
Somebody is walking across the street and they're just about to step into the roadway, and you're a driver and you're respecting the speed laws, you're going slow enough, should be able to visibly see, if you will, visual impairments to seeing somebody who's on an island. It's designed in a way so that it's clear. I would say if somebody's walking across the street, and whether they're right at the curb line or a half a step away, be polite, give them a break, let them get across the street. It's going to take 2, 3, 4 seconds for them to clear the road lane for you to make it. The law, and you're the law enforcement officer, I'm not an attorney, is clear that it says if you're in this type of an environment, that the law becomes in effect when the pedestrian's at the curb line itself.
Okay. The other question I would have on that specific design is that design, because there is that center lane, that they could put that out there, so that's why you're not seeing this on other roadways.
There's one is you need to have the physical conditions, so the center turn lane creates a sufficient width for you to put an island in place. There also needs to be certain traffic speed and pedestrian volume. So they're not, though treatment like that total might be 15, 20, as high as $30,000 by the time you get done with the concrete work, so on and so forth. So they're not inexpensive, and we try to be wise with our use of public resources. We put them in the environments where they're warranted, where there's an issue with pedestrian safety or pedestrian mobility.
Let's go ahead and look at our next slide. Is a picture of Eisenhower at Plaza Drive. That crosswalk, if you look at it, it's kind of like an offset crosswalk. Can you give me an idea of how that was designed and why it was set up that way?
So one of the interesting things is when you have these separated crosswalks, your focus or the intent is to design it so that the pedestrian is looking at the oncoming traffic. If you have a direct crosswalk, what happens is you're looking forward. By having what's called a Z crossing, you're now crossing the street after having seen it safe to cross that way. You're in a safe median, and the sidewalk forces the pedestrian to look at the traffic that's coming at them. So that's the design behind these type of Z crosswalks. It might take a pedestrian 15, 20 feet out of their way if we have that amount of space available, but it literally turns the person so they're looking at oncoming traffic as they make the second crossing of that crosswalk.
So basically it's set up for the safety of the pedestrian more so than anything else.
Safety of the pedestrian and the transportation user. I don't know, you have more interaction with drivers who might have struck a pedestrian, but my sense is that it's probably an impact more so physically on the person who gets struck, but the drivers themselves have to deal with the after effects of having hit another human being with their vehicle, probably, depending on the circumstances, hurt them.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. We did have an accident at this intersection about a year ago. It was during cold weather. A pedestrian was crossing. What the problem was is the person in the right lane yielded to the pedestrian. The person in the left lane wasn't paying attention. The pedestrian was not paying attention to the left-hand lane and stepped out in front of the vehicle that didn't stop. So I can see exactly what you're saying. We've had those problems with these type of things when they're multiple lane crosswalks.
I appreciate you pointing that out because it gives me the opportunity again to refer to what every driver must know, is that if a vehicle is stopped for a pedestrian crossing a multi-lane crosswalk, it's illegal to overtake or pass that car. So for the pedestrian who wasn't paying attention, it's not good to be hurt but still be right. But by law, they were right because the second driver should not have overtaken the car that was stopped. So for you drivers at home, if you're on a multi-lane road, 2 lanes, 4-lane road, and a vehicle is stopped at a crosswalk, please know that it's a state law that you're not allowed to overtake or pass that vehicle until it's safe to do so.
Thank you for explaining that, Eli. Let's go ahead to the next video. What this is the intersection of where Division crosses down into Broadway. I believe you can see 3 different crosswalks in that area. There's a lot of signage in that area. You have the crosswalk indicated on the roadway painted with probably reflective striping. You have neon yellow signs that indicate that there's a crosswalk there, and you also have a specific sign that's located in the center of the lanes there. Can you give me an idea of what they call that sign in between the lanes and what its purpose is for?
Well, when you say the sign, it is a traffic sign. If I were the traffic engineer, I'd give you the specific code number for it.
Okay.
But it is designed, it's a narrow, smaller sign so that it literally fits on the center line of a roadway. So it's designed for that purpose to give more of a visual presence to the crosswalk. In some instances, we place 3 across, both on the center lane and then on the edge lines, and those create what appears to the driver to be a more narrow driving area, although the signs are literally right on the line, so they're not any narrower, but they do result in the drivers paying a lot more attention as they try to navigate through a gateway crossing. So 3 in a row is called a gateway. That is merely a pedestrian placard that highlights the crosswalk. The other thing, and I appreciate you noting the neon yellow signs, those are high visibility signs. Again, this is an area where the speed of traffic coming down Division might be a little faster, and this is to give the driver enough awareness that there is a crosswalk here, and that if a person's there, whether it's under the Michigan Vehicle Code or the local ordinance, stop to allow the pedestrian because they have the legal right-of-way to cross the street.
By looking at that picture, do you think that there should be any design changes with all those crosswalks in that one specific area? It seems to me like there's a lot of things going on. I know the roadway well. As you're coming down Division, you're entering into a curve there. Again, we've had some accidents at this intersection here where in the wintertime when it's slippery, pedestrians will cross, a person will hit their brakes, lose control, and they actually ended up in the center median portion of that. Are you in favor of the way that's designed there, or do you think maybe we should take another look at it and do something different?
So, Jeff, I think there's always a good opportunity to take another look at it, although I'm going to reserve commenting on the current design. I was not here back in the 1990s when there was quite a design process around the Broadway bridges when that project was built, and I'm familiar with the engineer who did that work. What we gives me an opportunity to highlight what we talk about now as a Vision Zero approach. So if there are issues that are obvious to our system, either based on a review of the geometrics, the conditions that are out there, and we're also looking at regular crash reporting, not just this year, but we look back over time to see if there's an identified crash history at a location. We're now taking a harder look at locations such as this to see if they do have a high crash potential, and if they do, in fact, we would go through a design review process to see what else could be done in order to create a safer and better crossing.
I appreciate you bringing that to our attention because we do get a lot of questions in regards to that intersection there, so I think that's going to be very helpful for us. Let's go ahead and look at another slide here. Where this is located would be on Stadium near 7th, out in front of Pioneer High School. Again, you're going to see some different signage here. You can see the high visibility school crosswalk sign there, which also has the amber flashing lights. And you'll see where it says stop here for pedestrians, and actually in the roadway there is a stop bar that is painted on the roadway. Is there anything different that has to be marked in school zones for crosswalks, or can you kind of explain why this one's marked in this manner?
Well, and again, this is an example of what's a lot of information to give to drivers. The most important situation is for a driver not to be looking at the signs, but to keep an eye on where they're going, and if there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk, to stop for them. What the variety of signs that are in this image, the stop here for pedestrians, is aligned with the stop bar. And that, again, is an indication that every driver must know if there's a stop bar and a stop condition in the roadway, that's where you're supposed to stop. Not stop on the crosswalk as was shown in one of the earlier videos. So in this instance, the project team, the engineer that designed this said, let's make sure that we put the stop here sign. The school crossing sign is a device that corresponds to, and I'll refer back to, the Michigan Vehicle Code and what every driver should know. There are different laws that affect the presence of a school crossing zone. And so the different sign is both an indication to motorists that there's actually a school present, and the expectation is that you'll have more frequent occurrences to interact with students that may or may not be old enough to be paying attention. So it's a message to drivers. The amber flashing device is what is referred to as a RRFB, rectangular rapid flashing beacon. And there's been research that has shown that installing RRFBs increases the yield compliance rate into the high 80s. It's as effective as a red light, especially because it's an actuated sign, which means when you look at the image on the screen now, it's in a quiet or dark mode. If there was actually a pedestrian that needed to cross that street, there's a button for them to push that it activates the flashing LED beacons, and both the pattern of the flash and the brightness of the LED reinforces that it was actuated by a pedestrian, it's associated with the school crossing sign, and the stop here sign indicates to the driver where you're supposed to stop. And it says stop here for a pedestrian. It doesn't just say stop here. So one of the things that I've experienced in Ann Arbor is sometimes there's not a pedestrian in the crosswalk and some drivers are stopping. Please be advised that although it is an indication of a stop sign, it's operated by the rest of the message, which says when there's a pedestrian, And that's what's important to note as well.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. Many times we'll be out on patrol and people are so confused at times because of the signage that they'll actually stop when they see the little red stop sign for pedestrians and crosswalk, and they look both ways to make sure that there is nobody there, which does create a bit of a hazard, especially for the cars that are behind them. One of the other things that we get a lot of questions is why is it that there are only specific intersections that have the rapid flash, that they don't put those at all the crossings?
Well, again, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that they're not necessary at all crossings. If you have, and I'll use Liberty as an example, a roadway that has traffic at 25 to 30 miles an hour, it's a 2-lane road with pedestrian crossing islands. There's clear lines of sight, so the pedestrian has a ability to see cars coming. The cars have clear sight, able to see pedestrians. With the islands, pedestrian has to walk 10, 11 feet. Those conditions are deemed to be safe enough. Let's look at another environment. Let's go out to Plymouth Road, where we have a 5-lane cross section and traffic moving at 35, 40 miles an hour, 2 cars abreast in both directions. Under those circumstances, drivers paying attention to driving. And so it takes what I call a screaming beacon to let them know that, hey, the state law, the city code requires me to allow pedestrians the right of way when they're present. The flashing light tells me that they're up ahead, and I need to get off the accelerator and slow down and stop in order to allow that pedestrian, if present, to safely get across the street.
Okay. I know most of us are familiar with the Plymouth Road beacons because those were one of the first ones. Right. What we're going to show is the next slide, which is going to be a specific traffic control device that's located at Chapin and Huron Street. I believe this was the first one that was ever put out there. And this one's a little different than all the other ones because it's not a rapid flashing, it's actually a red light. It starts as a blinking red and then goes to a solid red. Can you explain the difference in this signal and why maybe it was put there instead of a rapid flashing light?
So for folks at home who are familiar with this intersection, to the north of 3rd and Chapin at Huron is West Park, access to West Park. Just to the south of it is the YMCA, and this is a very busy pedestrian corridor. Huron, as a state trunk line, also carries a lot of traffic in and out of our downtown. What was requested was a full on traffic signal. The traffic engineering community use a term warrants. Is there enough traffic, enough condition present to actually justify placing a full traffic signal? This location, going back to the early 2000s, did not have enough volume on the side streets to justify a full traffic light. So the pedestrian hybrid beacon, the Hawk as it's referred to informally or casually, was a device that was designed where you needed to have a stop condition for vehicles so pedestrians can get across the street, but it didn't meet the conditions for a full-on traffic signal. This was the first one in Michigan. We volunteered with the Michigan DOT to have a demonstration of the technology here. It has served very well over the last 9 or 10 years that it's been in place. I know that it's the only one of its kind in the city. There's another one in Washtenaw County, but that it is somewhat unique. But what I hear a lot from citizens and what I believe stands true for this, red means stop. Now, red doesn't always mean complete stop in this circumstance, because what happens is when the dual red lights are illuminated, it is a legal traffic signal and drivers must stop for it. After a certain amount of time, the double red signal goes to a flashing red signal. Flashing red indicates stop and proceed when safe to go. And so that's the way the cadence and the signal operation for this works. If a full-on traffic signal was dark, that constitutes an environment where you have the high potential for crashes. With this, its normal status is dark or quiet, and similar to the flashing beacon, it only wakes up when a pedestrian is present, which is another positive reinforcement to driver. When they see this either yellow or red, to be more vigilant that a pedestrian is in the vicinity and wants to cross. But when it's dark, it doesn't slow down traffic. And so that's where it's a little better than the little signs that say stop, but it only means stop when there's a pedestrian. When this is sleeping, you can just drive right through it. When it wakes up, It's a notice to drivers, and we are in the process of coordinating with our traffic engineers and others in the community. This intersection is now at a point where it is very close, or it does meet warrants, under review by MDOT, and this intersection may be reverted to or converted to a full traffic signal, which will clear up some of the confusion that appears to exist. But if you embrace the red means stop and double reds means stop twice as many times, it actually just means, because this is unusual, it might be dark, now it's 2 red balls over each lane, stop, and when they start to do what they call the wig-wag or flashing, that's an indication that if the pedestrian's already crossed on the other side of the street, it's safe to proceed.
I also think that it's pretty self-explanatory as far as when you see a flashing red light, you come to a complete stop, make sure it's clear and go. And then when it is a solid red light, obviously you're supposed to come to a stop, which makes people aware that, yeah, there are pedestrians in there and that they are required to stop. The only other thing is that there are some intersections that don't have any signage at all. All they have is the white lines on the roadway marked as a crosswalk. Is there any specific reason that maybe there's not signs at those locations, or is it something that maybe in the process, in the works of putting signs out due to budgetary constraints or anything?
Well, the ones that are marked have been measured, pedestrian activity has been noted, measured, and they're available there. Where you have unmarked crosswalks, which are identified within the Michigan Vehicle Code, that anytime you have an intersection of streets, whether there's markings and signs or whether it's an unmarked area, it's still a crosswalk, and the rules of law are that a driver should yield to a pedestrian, and for folks who have questions about that, refer back to the Michigan Vehicle Code. There are budgetary issues, but it's really more that we try to invest the resources we have where they provide the greatest protection. So on the higher classification roadways, we talked about Eisenhower, we talked about Plymouth, we've invested in a rapid flashing beacon, the pedestrian islands and the like, in order to get a good return on our safety investment. And in areas where there are not markings in the street, probably very few, if any, pedestrians, even though it still is a crosswalk.
Okay, when you get to an intersection, and there's a crosswalk in an intersection, at what point does the pedestrian no longer have the right of way to cross the street? Is it when the flash walk, no walk signal goes, or is it actually after the light turns red?
This is a little more complicated, and I'm going to try to cover it quickly. When the walk indication, the white pedestrian lights up, that's clearly a sufficient time for any pedestrian to get all the way across the street. It converts to the red flash not when it's no longer safe to be in the crosswalk, but that's an indication that if you have limited mobility, that you don't have enough time to make it all the way to the other side of the street. So if you're near the curb and it goes from white to red flashing and you're jogging, you can easily still get across. What the rules of law say is that if you're already in the crosswalk and you're crossing and it turns, the signals turn to red and traffic begins to go, that the traffic still has to yield the right of way to that pedestrian. So it's not against the law to initiate a crossing when the red is flashing, but it's advisable, as I said earlier, look both ways, make sure it's safe to cross. In the future, the countdown, you'll know whether you're a 7 or a 12, how long does it take you to get to the other side, and we're deploying more and more of those countdown pedestrian heads as time goes on.
Okay, well, it sounds again like everything here is geared towards safety. And we're going to go ahead and start to wrap up the show here. I want to thank you for coming on today.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Hopefully this has been extremely informative to the people out there that have questions in regards to crosswalks. Hopefully it's clarified some information of why they're marked the way they are. Also, you know, we just want to put out there that, yes, we are an enforcement agency as the police department, but we're not out here to, you know, get into your pocketbook and cause you fines and stuff. Basically, our job is pedestrian safety and vehicle safety. So we're out there trying to keep people safe as well as the city planning. So in wrap up of the show, hopefully this has been an informative show for you. You understand a little bit better what the crosswalks are in the city. And this is the end of the Ann Arbor Shield. Have a good day and stay safe.